Chapter 3. A Trip into the Supernatural. The Canadian Merchant Navy attracted me because someone whom I knew had joined and told me how much he enjoyed it. Having the Royal Navy and Air Force watching over you, merchant shipping was the lifeline of the armed forces, gave you a secure feeling. For 2½ years I worked in the engine rooms of the various ships I was assigned to, most of the time as a fireman. I can remember coming on watch and saying to myself, I hope no torpedo slams into these boilers while I stand here. A number of men whom I knew perished at sea. That merchant navy experience served to harden me more against God and man. Good jobs were hard to find in Montreal after the war, because thousands of discharged servicemen swarmed the city looking for employment. I decided to learn a trade, something I could enjoy doing that would have some creativity to it. I didn't want a job just for the sake of earning a living, so I decided to take my time and make sure that when I decided on a particular choice, I would really enjoy it. Meanwhile, to occupy time, I accepted a job at the Windsor bowling alleys located on St. Catherine Street West. At the time, it was one of the nicest places in Montreal for that type of amusement. I was assistant to the manager of the billiard room. The work wasn't hard, I met a lot of people, and it was a good pastime. I had not been employed there long when an old buddy I had sailed with at the beginning of my merchant navy experience came walking in. Delighted to find that both of us were still alive, we had dinner together that evening and talked about many things. One topic that my friend Roland spoke about with great enthusiasm was his new interest in the supernatural. He told me how fortunate he was in having become acquainted with a group of people who were members of a society that communicated with the dead. The spiritualist medium had Roland talk with his father, who had died when he was only 10 years old. His father's spirit had given him much advice about the future. While it was interesting to hear Roland's experiences with the supernatural, they gave me a weird feeling. Then he asked me whether I would be interested in attending one of their seances. Maybe the medium could have you talk to the spirit of your dead mother. You would like that, wouldn't you? His enthusiasm abated some when he realized that I was so shocked that I could not answer. After a few seconds of silence, he continued, You wouldn't be afraid of talking to the departed soul of your dead mother, would you? Somehow I managed to say that I wouldn't, but I would like a little time to consider it, having never thought about such a thing before. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, Morneau, you're afraid. I can tell by the way you look at me. It's written all over your face. Man, you have changed a lot since I saw you last. The Roger Morneau I knew was afraid of nothing. I recall the time when you and I were deckheads along with 6 other neophytes, and the first mate came to us and said he needed a volunteer to go up and paint the upper portion of the main mast the next day. Which one of you is willing to go up there? He said. The height is not great, it's only 70 feet, but one has to have a lot of nerve once he has reached the top. He has to get off the board he sat on while being pulled up with a rope, and lie on his stomach across the top of the mast. It was 2 feet in diameter, in order to paint on the opposite side. All of us were scared to death to go up there, and we were delighted to hear you tell the first mate that you would. Talk about courage, fellow, you had it. Now, tell me, you're not going to chicken out on coming with me to our next seance, are you? After that little speech, I couldn't refuse. Suddenly I had to live up to the image of Roger Morneau being afraid of nothing. I was hooked. Thus, one Saturday evening, my friend and I found ourselves in a home where a visiting medium was to be an honored guest, and we were introduced to some of the others present. One couple in particular we felt honored to meet. The man was a professional entertainer, a jazz band leader currently in great demand. His band played in the most elegant night spots. Late that evening, after the séance concluded and some of the guests were prepared to leave, the band leader turned to his wife and said, Honey, what do you say that we depart, as it's getting late? At the moment, she was conversing with the medium, whom she found most interesting. George, why don't you go home and get your rest? She replied, and I'll stay a little while longer and have the Bellingers drive me home. He agreed with her suggestion and proceeded out of the house just as Roland and I left. Once outside, George turned to us and said, You fellows driving? No, we're going to take the streetcar about 2 blocks from here, I said. "I'll be glad to drive you there. Jump in." During the evening the subject had come up that both of us had been in the merchant navy during the war. The spirit medium had conjured the supposed spirit of one of Roland's co-workers who had perished when the ship they were on sank. As we entered George's automobile, he began to ask about the dangers of our work during the war. But in no time at all we had reached our destination. He then made a suggestion. "What do you say that we go to a restaurant and have a bite to eat, and at the same time you could tell me about your adventures during the war? They fascinate me. It would be my treat. Then I'll drive you home." George drove to St. Catherine Street West, an area known by the natives as the gourmet restaurant section of Montreal. Suddenly he steered his deluxe Lincoln into a narrow drive leading to the rear of one of his favorite eating spots, then left the car parked behind a black Cadillac, saying, "Joe is here. He's the owner of the place, a fine fellow." When we entered the place, a hostess informed us that we would have to wait in the lounge until a table became available. As we headed there, Joe spotted George from quite a distance away and came over to greet him. Informed that we were waiting for a table, Joe stated that we wouldn't have to. A telephone call a couple of minutes earlier had just canceled a reserved table. It was ours for the taking. We followed the owner, who removed the reserved sign from the table and sat us down. The cocktail waitress came over and took our order for drinks. She said that we might have to wait a little longer than usual for our food to reach us because the place was filled to over capacity. George asked for a double in his favorite alcoholic beverage in order to occupy time. Then we answered his questions about the merchant navy and talked of our interest and activities with the supernatural. A fair amount of time elapsed until our food came, and we consumed the second order of drinks. It put George in a talkative mood, which in turn made him willing to tell us many things that I doubt he would have mentioned under normal circumstances. For instance, I asked whether he would tell us a little about how he became so famous in his profession. "I don't mind at all," he said. "As a matter of fact, I'll tell you the real and true reason of my success, something my wife doesn't even know about, but you must promise to keep it in strict confidence." We assured him that whatever he mentioned would remain a secret. "You fellows know anything about demon worship?" "I don't," I answered. "Why do you ask?" Without answering my question, he inquired, "How long have you fellows been involved with sorcery?" "George, I don't understand what you're getting at. What do you mean?" "What I mean to say is, how long have you been pretending to hold communication with the dead?" "Not very long for me," I replied. "I see where you guys have a lot to learn when it comes to the supernatural. You're both wasting your time by going to those spiritualistic seances. Don't get me wrong, they have their place. They're a good pastime for women in that they receive some comfort from thinking that they're getting guidance in their lives. Through some departed loved one. You see, the reason I attended the seance this evening was just to make my wife happy. I go with her a couple of times a year to make her feel that I'm concerned with her interests. That's the only reason. What she doesn't know is that I have learned to go to the very source of that power, where a person can get real action. Demon worship, that is." Of all that he had said to us, one sentence stood out in my mind. "George, would you clarify the question you asked us a little while ago? How long have you been pretending to hold communication with the dead? What do you mean by the word pretending?" He smiled, glanced at his watch, and said, "It's too late to explain that one tonight. But let me tell you this, you have not been talking with the dead." Then he went back to discussing his personal success. "You see, for years it seemed I was a failure in organizing and maintaining my own jazz band. Then I was fortunate enough to be introduced to demon worship, and by that great power I have obtained everything I had always wanted. Of course, I had to become acquainted with certain rituals that I needed to perform before the spirits began to work things out in my behalf." His face lit up with a big smile. "From that day on, it was instant success for me and my band. Recognition came to us overnight. Without any effort on our part, we were discovered, though we had been there all the time, and heralded as one of the great bands in our field. Somehow the news media got all excited about us. We became the talk of the town. The leading people of the radio world discussed us, and in no time we reached the top." George took another sip from his glass, a puff from his cigarette, and continued, "We have been in constant demand ever since. Money flows in. Our fees are the highest in the industry. People like to dance to our music. In reality, the spirits take control of us, or in other words, possess us, energize us, and in turn we pass the influence on to the people. They like what they get and keep returning for more of the same. Leaning back and lighting another cigarette, he chuckled a little and said, "You guys have got to hear this. I had an interview on radio about a month ago, and I really enjoyed myself. There were 6 of the top people of the radio world from Montreal and Toronto conversing with me. Everything I said seemed to fascinate them. In fact, I was amazed over my instant responses. Never had I been so witty in my life, and I enjoyed the attention they gave me. It almost reached a state of worship. In addition, they were trying to figure me out, and when we parted they still hadn't succeeded." Looking at his watch once more, he said, "Fellows, it's getting very late. What do you say that we get rolling for home?" Waiting to get his check, George commented, "That success of mine is easy to figure out once a person understands the mighty power of the spirits and the process involved in getting that power to working for you." Amazed at what he had told us, Roland and I asked him to tell us more about it as we drove home. "I feel impressed to tell you of my experience because I believe you're looking for something powerful to benefit your lives, and I know that you will not find it by attending seances such as the one you were at this evening. Let me put it to you this way. Why do you want to play in the little leagues when you can be in the majors?" My friend then asked him to tell us how to get into the major leagues of the spirit world. "You two are truly brave young men," George said, "and have done a lot for our country. Now I'm going to do something great for you. I will arrange to have you both attend our next spirit worship assembly." Then George, glancing from side to side, an air of indecision about him, finally said, "There is one point I want to assure myself of. I presume you have no reverence for Christ in your life. Am I right? The reason I ask is that we can't have anyone there who has any loyalty to the Christian God, as it could be disastrous." We both assured him that we had blasphemed God and gone past the point of no return. "I became aware of that fact this evening," he continued, "in that the conjured spirits seemed to favor you two above all the people present there. I hope that my question did not offend you. I had to ask it just to make doubly sure that you guys are okay." Although I was somewhat reluctant to attend a gathering of demon worshippers, my friend Roland had no hesitation in doing so. He reasoned that since we were going to hell anyway to burn throughout eternity, we might as well get acquainted with some of the folks before we arrived. I assumed that George might never contact us again, since he had been drunk when he made the invitation, and in the morning probably would not even remember half of what he had said the night before. But a few days later we both received a call to be ready at 8 o'clock the following evening, when he would pick us up. That ne'er-to-be-forgotten evening began by George filling us in on many details of the secret society to which he belonged. He wasn't a fast driver, and seemed reluctant to pass streetcars in motion. We must have made probably 100 stops on our way to the meeting, so we had a lot of time to converse before we reached our destination. George told us that we should not be surprised to meet some of the great and successful people of Montreal, and named at least a half-dozen of the more notable ones. His statement surprised me in that I had already concluded that we would meet a group of tough-looking characters. But on the contrary, every one was surprisingly well-mannered, superbly dressed, and possessed a winning personality. They made us feel as if they had known us for a long time, and we were part of the group. The meeting convened about 15 minutes after our arrival. It was most informal. The people spent about 2 hours telling of the fantastic accomplishments they had attained through the workings of the spirits, mainly business transactions resulting in great profits to themselves as a result of their abilities to use clairvoyance and mental telepathy, by way of the spirits, to influence people in their decisions. One man told of how, as an astrologer using divination, he became a counselor to certain wealthy persons in their investments, and was himself becoming rich. He explained how a demon spirit hovered at his side during each session to give him precise information, audible to him but not the client, on how they should invest and when. "These rich folks have the means to invest," he said. "I have the know-how to make it pay off." Highly impressed, my friend asked whether he ever worried about being cheated on his share of the returns. "I counsel on a percentage of the returns on investments. As you are well aware, the astrology bit is only a come-on. I have no worry. My familiar spirits look out for my well-being. Let me illustrate. One couple tried to deprive me of my fair share of one profitable industrial real estate transaction. They presented me with a check making up quite a bundle, and I felt satisfied until my familiar spirit told me to ask them when they were going to give me the additional $1,700 that made up my correct share of the profits on that particular investment. The wife fainted, and the husband was terrified. He quickly explained that they had no intentions to cheat me, and the money would be in my hands within 24 hours. After each success story, the individual would always praise or give credit to a particular spirit by name, and many times referred to the spirit as Lord of his life. During the time I was involved with demon worshippers, I observed that in their testimonies of how the spirits had worked for them, they often referred to a demon as Lord God. For instance, one would say, "It was wonderful to see the Lord God Beelzebub's power exhibited in my behalf on such and such a day." Or someone would ask, "Sam, how have you been since I saw you last?" The reply would be, "Real fine, thank you. The gods have really benefited my life in wonderful ways." That evening one individual impressed me greatly. A medical doctor, he explained how the spirits had given him great hypnotic and healing powers, including the ability to take away pain and to stop bleeding in wounds and severe cuts. After telling some fascinating accounts of his healing people, he announced he must go down to the worship room. "Will you, friends, please excuse me?" he said. "I need to go and perform acts of devotion so as to be regenerated by the Lord God Nehushtan. I depend on his vivifying power to revive and heal my patients." An hour after the meeting started, a latecomer appeared. A number of people greeted him, referring to him as Charmer. As we drove back home late that evening, I asked George, "What about that dignified-looking gentleman who came in late? Some addressed him as Charmer. Does the name have any particular significance?" "It does, but I can't say anything about him now. After you have attended a few of our meetings and you become part of the group, remind me to tell you about him. He's a fascinating individual. In fact, he is believed among us to have been the greatest charmer or hypnotist who has ever walked the sidewalks of Montreal. By the way, fellows, I was delighted to see how everyone this evening took to you guys. It made me feel good to see that. Understand this, we are a closely knit group. In fact, I had a hard time getting permission to bring you with me to this meeting. At first I was refused the privilege. Then, through the working of a spirit counselor appearing to our leader on vacation in the USA, I received a phone call giving me the okay, and the way opened for you to associate with us and eventually become members of our society. I'll tell you more about it sometime in the future." I felt somewhat uncomfortable when I heard George assuming that I was going to become one of them, but the whole thing overjoyed Roland. After a few visits, George said, "I'll have you come downstairs to see our worship room. I think you will find it quite impressive. However, it will not be possible for you to visit the worship room of the gods until the Satanist priest is present, and only then after receiving the approval of the spirits." The meeting had taken place in a private home, a luxurious Montreal residence. As we visited on the main floor, we could hear, faintly coming from the basement level, sounds that closely resembled the type of religious music and chanting used by the people of India. Every so often, some of the people would go downstairs, returning about 30 minutes or so later. All that activity prompted George to lean toward me as we sat on a sofa, saying softly, "Our worship room is downstairs. I'll tell you about it after we leave this evening." About 6 weeks after we had met the man called Charmer, I asked George one evening as we were returning home whether he felt like telling us about him. "Oh yes, you fellows should hear about that fascinating individual. But first I would like to remind you that we are, generally speaking, a law-abiding group of citizens. I don't know of any one of us who wouldn't give the shirt off his back to help someone. And we never really take advantage of people with the powers the spirits have passed on to us. But in the case of Charmer, well, he is somewhat different from the rest of us. It appears that he has a weakness in his character, and because of it employed his great hypnotic power, or gift, in a way that he should not have done. I should say that he lost his sense of direction for a short while. He is a sharp businessman, owns 2 nightclubs, and has been doing exceedingly well. And as I said before, he is a powerful hypnotist. He can place a person under his spell, or in a hypnotic trance in less than 10 seconds if he or she agrees to look him straight in the eyes. Having 2 nightclubs, he has a lot of contact with show business people. Most groups stay for an engagement about 4 to 6 weeks, then move on to another area. We became aware of the fact that some of the groups were breaking up or would lose one of their members after performing in one of his clubs, and the dropout was always female. About 6 months ago, the Montreal Vice Squad raided a plush house of prostitution where all the girls consisted of former nightclub entertainers, and every one of them had worked for him. You see, George continued, those girls would never have found themselves in the situation they were in if they had not agreed to let someone hypnotize them. Such a person can never from then on resist the hypnotist's power. Hypnotist's power. Hypnotist's power.